Hey, what's up guys? In this episode, we're going to build Flappy Bird. But first, be sure to subscribe, and if you like the channel and you like the videos, show your support over on our Patreon page. Alright, so this video is the first of many in a new series on game development using Unity3D. So if you don't already have Unity, then go over to Unity3D.com and download it. It is free, and it comes with everything that you need to get started and build games, so you don't need Visual Studio. You don't got to worry about that. Just download it, install it, and you're good to go. All right, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is open up Unity, and we're going to start a new project. Choose 2D. We'll give it a name, Flappy Bird, and we'll save it to Flappy Bird folder, and create project. This might take some time, so I'm going to fast forward. Okay, now that Unity is open, first thing we need to do is import our assets. And these assets are the sprites and the font. In the sprites, we have Flappy Bird. We've got our column, our ground, and our sky. And then in the fonts, we just have the Flappy Bird style font. So now we need to add a game controller. We'll do this by right-clicking in the hierarchy, create empty, and we'll call this game controller. And this is just an object that's going to hold our game control script. So let's do that now by clicking add component. We'll type in game control, and because there's no object called game control, our options are to add a new script. So we'll do that. The name of the script is game control. Language is C#, and we'll click create and add. Once that's done, you can double click on the script and it will either open Visual Studio or Mono Develop. In this case, it has opened up Visual Studio for me. Okay, so the game control script is going to basically manage our entire game. So we're going to need to reference this in a few different places. So let's go ahead and create a singleton. Next, we need to set up some variables. The first one will be our scroll speed. That's how fast the game world will scroll by, and we'll set that to -1.5. Next up is the game over? Set that to false. And then the next one is our score. We'll initialize that to 0. Then we need to get some handles for some of the game world objects, in this case UI elements. And this is going to be text, and we'll need to add a reference to the Unity engine.ui namespace. Score text. And then another one for the game over text. So let's start out by initializing our game control, and we'll do this by changing start to awake. Awake happens before startup does, and we want to do this so that we can get in as early as possible. We're going to set instance to this if it's not already set to something. And if instance is not equal to this, then we're going to destroy game object, which is a built-in variable with a reference to whatever this is. In our update, we're going to check if the game is over. And the user has pressed the mouse button. And what this is going to do is going to reset our scene. This allows the player to start over after they've died. And we need scene manager for this, and we'll add the Unity engine.scene management namespace. I'm going to load the scene. And what we're doing is we're telling the scene manager to load the current scene, and we do this by getting the current active scene, the build index for the current active scene, and then it's just going to reload the entire scene for us. Then we'll need to add a method for scoring. If the game is over, then just return. Otherwise, add one to the score. And then we're going to set the score text on the UI to actually update and display what the score is. Then we need a method that we can call after the player has died. And then we're going to set isGameOver is equal to true. And then we're going to set active the game over text. And that's just basically going to display the game over text on the UI. And we'll save it, and that is our game controller. So we'll go back to Unity, switch over to the scene view. Now let's start setting up our world. So we'll start out with grass. I'll just position it there. Now we're going to add in a sky, and you can see that the sky is now sitting above the ground or in front of the ground, and we don't want that. So let's set up our layers. We do this in the sorting layer. We don't have any at the moment, just the default, so let's add sorting layers. We're going to add a couple of them, actually. We'll add the background, midground, foreground, and the UI. So default will be the furthest back, followed by background, and then foreground, of course, will be in front of those, and then UI will be in front of everything else. So now we have our layers. Let's go back to our sky, and let's rename this to sky. And we'll change it to background. Okay, so sky is still in front of ground. That's because ground is still on the default sorting layer, which again is in the very, very back. So let's set that to foreground. And there we go, now it's in the front. We'll rename this to ground. Okay, and now we want these to move together, so we're going to nest them. And we do that just by dragging sky under ground. Now if we move them, now they move together. Let's undo that. Okay, so now we need to add some physics to our ground. So we'll select ground from the hierarchy, add component, and we'll give it a rigid body 2D. And this tells Unity that we want it to participate in the physics system, or we're going to interact with it in some way. And we'll change the body type to kinematic, and that means that we will be controlling the movement on our own. And then we'll add a box collider 2D, and we'll use this to detect any collisions with the ground. Now we need to resize this. Let's make it smaller, and then we'll move it down so you can see the green outline here. That is our collider, the boundaries, and we'll just line it up right there. That's good. Okay, and that's all we do for the ground for now. Next up, we need to add in some UI elements, and we do this by first adding a canvas. All UI elements need to be under a canvas. And when you add a canvas, by default, because this is a UI, you need to be able to interact with it. It comes with an event system, but we're not going to use that in this game, so let's just delete event system. On canvas, we need to change the render mode to screen space camera. And then we're going to drag the main camera over here to render camera, and that's going to set the camera. Then we need to change the sorting layer to UI so that it's in front of everything. Okay, now we need to add some text. So let's go down to UI, text, and we'll call this score text. Change the actual text to score of 0. And let's change the font to our Luckiest Guy font. We just drag that over right onto the font property. Change the size to 25. Set it centered. And then we'll set the overflow to actually overflow, so we're not bound by size limitations. And then we'll change the color to white. Okay, then we need to place it, so we'll come up here to our anchors. We'll choose anchors, hit the Alt key, and we'll choose the one for the bottom center. Okay, that looks good. Let's actually move it up a little bit. So up here in position, just set it right around there. That looks good. And to make it even better, let's add a shadow. And we'll give the effect distance x of 2 and y -2. That looks pretty good. And we need one more text, so let's duplicate this. Right click, duplicate. And this will be our game over text. Change the actual text to game over. We'll make this bigger, let's make this 35. And we'll set the position on the anchor to the top center. And we'll bring it down. That's good. Okay, now that we have our two text elements, if you remember, on our game controller, we added two public properties that we are expecting those to be set to. So our score text and our game over text. And these are object references. To set those, we'll just drag score text over here to the score text, and game over text over here to game over text. Now when our game controller object is instantiated, the score text and the game over text properties will be initialized with references to the UI elements that we just created. And then one more thing we forgot to do is our game over text. We don't want to see that all the time, only when we're actually died. So we'll come up here and we'll just uncheck the box and turn it off. Okay, so at this point we still don't have a game. We need to add some scripts. So let's start with the ground. Come over here, add component, and let's start off with scrolling object. New script. Now as the scripts are created, you'll see them in the assets folder, and you can move these into a separate scripts folder if you like. Okay, so our scrolling object script, and we'll just start off by adding a private rigid body 2D. And in the start, we're going to set the instance of that rigid body using get component rigid body 2D. And what this does is it gets the component that is associated with this instance of the script. In this case, it's going to be the rigid body for the ground, because we added this script to the ground object. Now, as you'll see later, we're going to also add this script, the same script, to columns and other things. And in those instances, this get component rigid body 2D will get instances of those objects. So in this case, we have ground. We just want to set the velocity equal new vector 2. And we want to get the game control instance. scroll speed, and we'll set the velocity on the y-axis to 0 because we don't want to go up or down, we just want it to go to the left. And we do this using scroll speed, which if you remember is -1.5, which means it will go to the left instead of the right. In the update method, we'll just check if the game is over. And if it is, then we want to stop the ground so it doesn't move. Or actually anything that has this script associated with it, we don't want it to move. So we'll change the velocity to vector2.0, which is a already implemented instance of vector2. It's just 0, 0 on the x and the y. And that's it for scrolling object. Pretty simple. So let's add one more. Because we need this background to repeat. So let's add a repeating background script. Okay, for the repeating background, we'll start out by adding private box collider 2D. And then we'll set up a float for the ground horizontal length. So the first thing we're going to do is get an instance of the box collider that has been applied to the object this script is associated with at the moment, which is of course the ground. So again, we do this with get component box collider 2D. And now that we have a reference to that, we're going to set the ground horizontal length is equal to the actual width of the ground collider itself. And we do this because when we added the box collider, it automatically resized itself to the width of the ground sprite. And so we can just reuse that. And later on, if we wanted to change the size of the ground, then we could do that and we wouldn't have to modify the script. Okay, so in update, we're just going to check if the position is less than negative ground horizontal length. And if it is, we're going to reposition background. And in here, we're going to create a new vector 2 called ground offset. And we're going to set that to 2 times the length of ground horizontal length. And then we're going to set the position and then we're going to set the position of the ground object to the current position plus the ground offset. Don't worry if this doesn't make sense, you'll see how it works in just a second. And we can see this by now playing our scene. Okay, so now you see this, the background is scrolling to the left. And now it comes back around. Okay, so this doesn't really help us. We're only halfway there. So what we need to do now is duplicate our ground object so that we have 2 of them. That way one can be on the screen at all times. Call this one ground 2. And we just need to reposition it so that it's directly after our first one. And we'll just do this by copying the size X property, which is at 20.48. So that is the absolute width of the box collider, and that's good enough for us. So we'll come up here to position on the X, paste it in, and now you can see we have a copy over here, and it's pretty seamless. So let's scroll this out so you can see it when we play. This is our game view, and this is our scene view. So in the scene view, you can see what's happening. This one will flip back over. There it is. Now it flips back over outside of the camera view, so the player doesn't see anything. It's all seamless. Okay, now we have those. Let's just organize them by creating an empty object. And we'll call this scenery. And we need to set these to 0. That way when we move our ground objects into it, they don't get offset in weird ways. There we go. So now let's set up our player. And our player is the Flappy bird. So we need to start out doing a few things first. This is a sprite sheet, which means it has multiple sprites in one image. So we need to slice this up. So first off, we'll come to sprite mode and we'll choose multiple. And then we'll go into the sprite editor. Yes, we want to apply those changes. Now the sprite editor allows you to do slicing. Basically, you're telling Unity how to slice up this sprite sheet so that it comes out into individual frames. In this case, we're just going to use the automatic. And we'll click slice. And you can barely see it here, but now you can see some outlines around the individual sprites or individual images. And that's good enough for us. So we'll hit apply. And we're good there. Now if you come over here, you can see we have 3 individual sprite images. And they all came out of this one sprite sheet. So go ahead and drag the first one onto the scene. And we'll rename it to bird. Okay, and he's hidden. So what we need to do is bring it to the foreground. All right. Now we need to add animations. Now there's 3 individual animations or states for this particular character. And the first one is idle. So we'll switch over to animation, or you can come up to window and animation. Select on bird and we'll create our idle animation. And we'll just drag our idle image up here to the first frame. And that's good enough. Create a new clip. And we'll call this one Flap. And then we'll drag our Flap sprite to the first frame. And we'll do the same thing for Die. We'll drag our death animation or our death sprite. And we're good there. So now we need to set up the transitions for these different animations. And we'll do this using the animator. So switch over to the animator tab or open it from the window menu and animator. You'll see this orange box. This is idle. This is our default animation that we created. And that's why it's orange. That's fine. So what we need to do is set up some transitions so that Unity knows how to go back and forth between the different sprites depending on what's happening. And we do this by right-clicking and choosing Make Transition. But before we do that, these transitions need to rely on something that we haven't set up yet. So let's set up some parameters. So up here in the Parameters tab, click on the plus button and we're going to choose Trigger. And this trigger is going to be called Flap. And then we'll add one more trigger called Die. Now make sure that you enter these correctly. We are going to reference them as strings later on. Okay, so now that we have those parameters, let's right click on idle and make transition, and we'll just drag it over onto Die. And now there's transition. So let's tell Unity how to make that transition by clicking on the transition line. And we'll come in here and let's just reset what Unity has set up by default. We don't need any of this stuff. What we want is conditions. So down here on the plus, we'll add a new condition, and this condition we want to use die. So this is our trigger that we just set up in the parameters. So when that trigger is active, it will make the transition from the idle over to die. Okay, now let's do the same thing for flap. So make transition. Clear these out. Add condition, and flap is already in there for us. So anytime the flap trigger is invoked, then it will go from the idle state to the flap state. Now, we need to get back to the idle state so that it actually looks animated. So now we need to make a transition from flap back to idle. So let's make that transition. And this time we're going to leave the settings as they are. So it has exit time. This means that once it comes into the flap state, it's going to run through this time, and then it will work its way back to idle. Okay. Switch back over to our scene, and we'll select our character, and we need to tell Unity that this needs to interact with the world, so we're going to add component, rigid body 2D, and this time we're going to leave body type as dynamic because we want the normal physics to be applied to this character, which means it will fall by itself. So if we come over here and click play, now you see the bird falls. Okay, and then we need to add a collider. So let's add a polygon collider 2D. And you can see that Unity has added a collider that is roughly the shape of our character sprite, so that's good enough. Now when we play it, the real world physics are kicking in and the bird falls to the ground and doesn't move. Okay, so now we need to set up our bird script. So we'll come back to add component, type in bird, new script, create an add. And if you don't want to add it through the add components, you can also right click in the assets, create C# script, and that'll do the same thing. Okay, so as usual, we need to set up some variables that we're going to use. The first one is going to be a float called upForce. Now upForce is what we're going to use to define the amount of force being applied to the character when they flap. And we're going to make this public so that if 200 is too much or too little, it can be adjusted from Unity. You don't have to come back in here to the script. And it also means that you could apply this script to other objects and change the upForce value independently of all of the other script instances. And then is dead, and we'll set that to false. Okay, now we need a reference to the rigid body 2D for the bird. And then we'll need a animator reference. And make sure that you're using animator, not animation. Some people get that mixed up and it doesn't quite work out too well. So in the update, we'll check if the bird is dead. If so, we'll return. If If not, we'll check the mouse input or left mouse click. Okay, if the player has pushed the left click button, then we're going to first set the velocity to 0 so that it stops moving. Then we're going to add force, and we'll give this a new vector 2. And we'll do 0 on the x-axis because we only want the bird to move up and down. And then on the y-axis, we will give it our up force variable. And since the user has given us input and we're moving the character, now we need to animate that. So we use our animator reference, set trigger, and this is where the parameters come in. We're going to type in flap. Remember, that's one of the parameters we set up in the animator. Okay, so that is going to provide us with our input and our character movement as well as our animation. So now we need to set up a method to handle our collision. So when we run into something, and we'll do this using onCollisionEnter2D. Now this is a method that is built into Unity. It's one that Unity is expecting. So if you're curious on the name, it has to be exact. So onCollisionEnter2D, this is expected when the colliders have been invoked or triggered. It will call into this method. And we'll set isDead equal to true because anytime we run into something, we want the character to die. And when they die, we'll set the velocity to 0 so it's no longer moving. And then we use our animator and set the die trigger so that it activates our die animation. And then we'll use game control instance and we'll call our die method. So let's switch back to Unity. And we'll play our scene. Okay. Now you can see when we click the mouse button, we get the flap animation and the character goes up. And well, let's hit the ground, and now we hit the ground and we have died. Awesome, now our player is set up. Now one thing that you got to be aware of is when you're playing, you are in this play mode and the play button is lit up. If you make any changes to your scene, to the objects, any changes like that, they will be reset once you stop playing. So make sure that any changes you make that you want to be permanent are done while you're not in the play mode. Okay, so now we have our character, we've got our backgrounds, now we need our obstacles. So let's set up our columns. And we'll just drag a column out here into our game world. We'll call it column 1. And we'll set the layer, the sorting layer, to middle ground. And we'll just give this -5. Okay. We'll add a component, rigid body 2D. And we'll take this from dynamic and we'll set it to kinematic, which means we're going to control it. Then we need to add a box collider. And let's resize the box collider. Okay, that's good. And then we will add our scrolling object script, which we created earlier. So it's already in the list, scrolling object. Okay, so that's good. Now we need to duplicate this. So we'll duplicate, call it column 2. And we just want to flip this around, so we'll rotate the z-axis 180, and we'll change this position from -5 to 7. Let's try 7.1. So you can change the difficulty of this particular game by changing the distance in between the two pillars. All right, we have these two set up, and now we need to group them together. So let's create an, create an empty object, and we'll call this one columns. We'll set the position to 0 so we don't have any weird translations. Move the columns into the columns group. Okay. Now we're going to be moving this as a whole, and we're going to be using this to actually invoke our score. So let's add a component, a box collider. And this time we're going to use this box collider, and we're going to set isTrigger. And what this does is, instead of causing a collision, so the bird would actually stop moving, all we're going to do is basically fire off an event or trigger an event and call out to the associated method, just so that we know that it happened. So in this case, let's set this behind the pillars. As you can see, we set this right behind the pillars, and the reason we do this is because when the bird has gone past the pillars, we want to give the bird a score, or give the player a score. And this is the mechanism we're going to use to do it. Okay, and because we're going to be moving these, we also need to add a rigid body, 2D, again, kinematic. And we also want to give this a scrolling object, script, and we need to add one more to actually deal with the scoring. So we will call this column. Okay, so in the column script, we're going to get rid of start and update, and really all we care about is the onTrigger enter2D method. And this one actually takes in a collider 2D, and we'll call this other. So the trigger enter2D method will be invoked when something hits or passes through the trigger that we created, and it will pass in a reference to what it was that triggered that event. So what we want to do is check if other get component bird not equal to null. We use game control instance.score to invoke the score. So what we're doing here is every time the bird or something else triggers that collider, we're going to come in here, we're going to check to see if whatever that object that triggered that collider was our bird. In this case, it always will be, but in other games, if you have multiple things flying around, it might not be. So in this case, we're just checking to see if the other component was a bird, and if it is, then we're going to increase our score. And then we'll save this. Okay. So now we need to create many copies of this column object because this is an endless game. So instead of creating hundreds and hundreds of copies of this manually, we're just going to create a new folder down here called prefab. And we're going to drag our columns object from the hierarchy down here to prefab. And then we'll delete the columns from our hierarchy. Okay, so we need one more script, and that is to actually handle the creation of the columns. And we're going to do that in the game controller. So let's just add a new component, and we're going to call this one column pool. And the column pool script is going to be responsible for spawning and moving around our columns in the game scene. So we'll set up some initial variables. Set up our spawn rate. That's how fast we spawn new columns, and we'll set that to 4F. set up our column pool size, and we'll just set it to 5. So we'll have 5 instances of that column object at any given time. And we'll set up a column Y min and max. And we use these to determine the position of the columns based on the y-axis when we generate those. Okay, and then we have our time since last spawn variable. It's going to keep track of how long it's been since we last spawned one. We've got our default spawn X position, and 10F is just off the screen. Then we have our current column index. Now we need a reference to our columns prefab. Then we have our array of columns. This was essentially our column pool. And then we just have our default object pool position. So somewhere in the scene, outside of the view of the camera, we're going to generate this pool of columns. And we just set this so that we can generate them somewhere in the world where the player doesn't see it. So now we need to initialize our column pool. And we're using pooling because it's far more efficient than trying to generate hundreds of objects and manage those in memory. So instead, with pooling, we're going to create a set number of columns, in this case, whatever column pool size is. So we'll set up 5, and then we'll just keep reusing those same 5. And that way it makes it far better for performance. And what we're doing is, for each of the column pool indexes, we're going to instantiate a new instance of the column prefab. And giving it the position to spawn at. And we're just telling it how to rotate. So you can set this to .identity, and that's good enough. And then we need to cast this actually to game object. Okay, so this sets up our column pool. So we're going to generate 5 instances of whatever we've set for the columns prefab, and they'll just get generated off screen somewhere using our object pool position. Now in the update, we're going to do all the magic movement. First thing is we add the time.delta time to the time since last spawn. Now the time.delta time is the time in seconds it took to complete the last frame. Okay, so essentially it's a time since this method was last run. Okay, if not game over, and the time since last spawn is greater than or equal to the spawn rate, then we'll go ahead and reset time since last spawn. We'll generate a new random position on the y-axis. And we do that using our column Y min and Y max. And this will just randomly position it up or down, just so we get the variation of the column positions. And then we will transform our current column to our default spawn X position, which is 10F, which is right off screen, and then the newly created randomly generated spawn Y position. We'll add one to our current columns. And if our current column is outside of the range, then we'll just reset it back to 0. Now, one thing that I found is I like to use Control S to save all my files, but for some reason it doesn't always work. As you can see, it still says it's not saved, so make sure you just save all, because if you don't save these, when you go back into Unity, it won't recognize the changes that you've made. Okay, so let's scroll out the scene, and we will take our game tab and we'll just move it over here, because I want you to see what's happening off screen. So let's hit the play button. And I died right away. Okay. Now nothing is happening, and you'll see that down here we have a null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance. We are all familiar with that. So we can go over here to the console, and this is where you can see all the errors in your script. And I already know what the problem is, but you can click on these for more information. So what we forgot to do was set our columns prefab instance here. So let's go back to our prefab, and we'll drag the columns prefab that we set up over here, and we'll set that reference over here on our column pool script. Now, you'll notice I've done that in the play mode. So when I click play to get out of play mode, come back to game controller, you can see that the changes we made have now disappeared. So let's drag that back over here, and now we're good to go. So let's hit play one more time. And you can see the columns down there on the bottom of the screen. And now they're getting spawned just outside of the camera. And our player can now go through them. They're varying on the y-axis. And as we're going through them, we're hitting that trigger collider, and we're increasing our score, and we died. Okay, so we'll stop this, bring our game tab back over here. Okay, so now we have a fully working version of Flappy Bird. If you've ever played Flappy Bird and you were infuriated because you could never score any points, well, now you can fix that. You can change the distance between the columns. You can make them wider for decreasing the difficulty, or you can make them closer together to increase the difficulty and frustration level. And there you go. All right, so that's it for this episode. Now, if you want the game files, remember you can go over to our Patreon page. And if you want to support the channel, you can become a patron and show your support that way. Click that subscribe button, hit the like button, or leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.